Alright, hello and welcome to our first at-home video lecture. This piece of paper that you're seeing here, Colonizing the New World, will be the note-taking guide that you need to complete this lecture. Please also have out a blank sheet of paper. I know our first part of this lecture, so the boxes were kind of small, and I'm imagining that we will need an additional piece of paper just to jot down some ideas. Especially ones that aren't necessarily on the slides themselves, but rather ones that I'm elaborating through the presentation. So please write down any and all information that will help contextualize this topic, which is the colonization of the New World. We left off with the Spanish, and we're going to be moving on to the French, British, and then we will be going back to Native Americans on that separate piece of paper. Okay, let's get started here. Alright, beginning with the French. So we'll begin with their economic and imperial goals. France is going to be fairly slow to colonize at first. Spain was out the gate going to be the quickest and the most aggressive colonizers of the New World. Spain has a lot of kind of internal things happening at the moment. They're going to be in kind of religious wars amongst themselves, but also with the British. Future note, war between Britain and France. Whenever we're talking about what's happening in Britain, what's happening in France, the answer to that question will be they will be at war for literally this entire semester. So that is the answer to every question. What's going on in Britain and France? They are at war. But because of that, they're going to be slow to attempt to colonize and to send out explorers. However, they will be trying to find that passage to Asia, just like Christopher Columbus was. This is all about trying to find a quicker passage to Asia that will ultimately save traders money. Now, the French idea was that there was going to be a northwest passage going through the Strait of St. Lawrence and into the Great Lakes in the northern region of the United States, just on that border of Canada and America. They're not going to find it. There is no Northwest Passage. However, along the way, they're going to find other valuable things that they can trade and make money off of, and that is beaver pelts. That's going to be a very fashionable item for both jackets and hats, and incredibly profitable for the French. Now, their religious goals. Ultimately, their desire is to convert Native Americans to Catholicism. This is going to be similar to the Spanish. They're going to have different techniques, though, different practices in this conversion process, and that's in part due to their reliance on the French to help them find beaver pelts. So there's going to be a much more of a cooperative interaction between the French and the Native Americans. That includes the economic goals of beaver pelts as well as the desires to Christianize. The result is they're going to have a fairly friendly relation. They're going to be treated as economic and military allies. We will talk about the Iroquois Confederation towards the end of this lecture, and as you will see, it was very important for the French to have military allies to protect them against warring Native American groups. The result also of this is that they will intermarry, just like the Spanish. The French colonizers who are coming to the New World are going to be interested in either finding that Northwest Passage or finding and bringing back beaver pelts. For those economic reasons, they are not bringing their wives, they are not bringing their families, and the result is going to be intermarrying. And that will also lead to, again, more friendly relations. So similar to the Spanish, except for the the major difference of killing and brutalizing Native American people. Okay, moving on to the British colonization characteristics. Again, let's begin with imperial and economic goals. The British are going to be a mixed bag. Just like the French, they're going to be slow to colonize. They are, at this point, breaking with the Catholic Church. France is a Catholic nation. Britain was a Catholic nation, and then they will split to a Protestant nation. And that actually begins kind of a long-standing war with France. Other context going on in England is that we're going to have a growing population, and they want economic opportunity. Primogeniture. Go ahead and highlight this word or put a star by it. This concept is going to restrict land opportunities to only the firstborn son. So, this is kind of a right of heritage, or inheritance rather. When you have your family and you have many children, the land only goes to the oldest son under primogeniture, which means you've got a bunch of kids who are kind of out of luck. And so what many of those that new generation did was try and find land in the new world. Joint stock companies are going to be the major method of this mode of transportation and funding to the new world. Again, we talked about this as kind of the birth of capitalism, and one of the main ways that these people were able to fund these trips across the new world. Religious goals. There are going to be some. We're going to talk about the different types of British who are coming to the New World, but many are going to be seeking religious refuge from the Anglican Church. We'll talk more about that in the week to come, but this is the classic story of coming to America for religious freedom. They were being persecuted by the Anglican Church, and they're wanting to start a new life. The specific groups that were wanting to do this were Puritans and Separatists. We'll learn more about these guys in the week to come, but ultimately they were incredibly persecuted. However, they also practiced a very strict and very different form of religion than the Anglican Church. And so at once, the Puritans and Separatists were fleeing. On the other hand, the British were really not stopping them from going. It was kind of a mutual leaving. Please go away. We're tired of hearing about your bickering and your rules. Now, interactions with Native Americans. This is going to be one that changes over time. Native Americans are going to really value trade between the British, and that's going to bind the two groups together for the initial contact. Native Americans are going to provide just great knowledge of food, shelter, clothing, local knowledge. How are you going to survive in this new world? Because as we'll learn next week, the environment, although seems similar to that of England, was dramatically different, and the British settlers are going to need extensive help with figuring out what to do. What the British provided to the exchange were metal tools. This was incredibly valuable to Native Americans, and for the first number of decades, this was a great exchange. Now, the biggest difference between the British colonizers and the French and the Spanish were that there was no intermarrying. Although this is not true across the board 100%, but by and large, the British will be coming with families. They will be wanting to set up a settlement. Now again, we're going to talk about Jamestown and some of the southern colonies that will be more economically motivated and therefore single young men will be the predominant group. However, when we look at the larger picture, most are not intermarrying because they are bringing families. Let's see. So at this point, let's see. If you can fit this on that same box, please continue to do so. If not, go ahead and move on to a blank sheet of paper, and we'll finish these notes off there. Let's talk about conceptions of Native Americans a little bit from the British. If you'll recall, we talked about the conceptions of the Spanish of Native Americans, and we had that image of lazy, docile, sinning, very much not just in tune with nature, but actually a part of nature itself. Going back to that engraving of the Native American woman lounging in her hammock while the Spaniard having his technology and shipbuilding capabilities. It was a drastic comparison, a stark comparison. So what were the British? What was the British conception? Surprisingly enough, at first, the British are not going to see themselves as superior. And this is for a number of different reasons. First off, I think today we view the British as, throughout much of history as the strongest nation in Europe. The sun never sets on the British Empire is how the saying goes. But at the beginning stages, the British were quite inferior on the social hierarchy in Europe. They had poor mining and metallurgy skills. They were slow to develop navigation techniques for their ships. So they didn't really think of themselves as highly as they will in the future. And believe it or not, there were a lot of similarities that the British identified between themselves and Native Americans. This was a belief in spirituality or magic. We'll talk more about this during the colonial era, but the Americas are not going to attract the leading minds in science and enlightenment. Believe it or not, this is going to be an area where many, even in comparison to what the time period was, which was not very scientifically advanced, many are going to have very magical explanations for their natural world. We'll talk about the Salem witch trial, and this is a great example of that. So both Native American spirituality and British belief in magic were quite similar. Now, oftentimes we think, the Europeans were superior because they had guns. And yes, that will be the case eventually. However, guns were not always superior, especially in the beginning century. A skilled archer with a bow could outkill somebody with a gun quite easily. This is due to the accuracy of the weapon. Early guns were not accurate, and the loading time that it took. So just because you had a gun did not mean you were superior in your fighting techniques. And then, the British looked at the Native Americans in this kind of nostalgic way. And I think this particular painting, or wood carving rather, is a great example of this. I mean, let's look at how this artist is portraying the Native Americans. They are ripped. They are proud. They have this great, posture that shows this kind of authority and confidence. And the British are going to see the Native Americans as this type of person that they used to be before the Middle Ages, when they were roaming the countryside and warring with neighboring kingdoms and relying much more on the land. They're going to see that as like, that's how we used to be, and if only we could get back to that nature where we're more in tune with our natural environment. They're going to see them very nostalgically. However, very similar, if you'll remember, to the Spanish. This is going to change very quickly, and specifically when the British see the rapid death of Native Americans to smallpox, that is going to really change their perception. No longer are Native Americans these great, strong, kind of natural wonders, but they are weak. Ultimately, Native Americans are not, the conclusion is Native Americans are not able to master their own environment, master their nature, and the British, therefore, are. And therefore, they are superior. They're then going to look at things like establishing a garden. The British garden is going to be a very common and kind of renowned architectural feature. That, for them, shows that they are containing nature, they're battling with it, they're keeping the weeds out, they're keeping the animals out, and they're propagating these beautiful flowers. And for them, this shows a mastery over their natural environment, and they're not seeing that in the same way for Native Americans. They look at the Native American landscape and they say, wow, this is just a wild wilderness. But let's take a moment and let's go back. Think to yourself, what were the ways, or were Native Americans actively managing their environment, or were they more passive, just passive with their environment? The answer is they were managers. How were they managing their environment? Through starting wildfires, through irrigation techniques. We'll talk about managing waterways in other ways by building dams and clearing land to encourage game that will come. So they managed their land in a different way than the British. The British didn't really recognize that as equal. So around this time, the relations between the British and the Native Americans are going to turn sour. They're going to go south. A growing British population is ultimately going to threaten land and resources that the two were once able to share. More British are coming. There's fewer hunting grounds. There's fewer, choice places to set up settlements, and there's going to be conflict. Once the British are settling and establishing their towns and settlements, they're not going to be as reliant on native peoples as well, so that power relationship shifts. So let's talk about the Native American societies, specifically in the Atlantic seaboard. Now, as we mentioned in the previous slide, there's going to be a long-standing tradition of trade. In fact, that's the one thing that is the commonality between this incredibly diverse group of people all throughout the Americas. And with this, they're used to adapting to newcomers. Their trade networks gave them contact to lots of new people, and so they're accustomed to new ideas, new types of rules, new customs, and how to deal with these people who maybe they don't speak the same language, but share a common goal of trade. Let's see. Now, in the Southwest, quite quickly after the Columbian Exchange, after the Spanish come, the horse is going to really spread like crazy in the Southwest. Very quickly, horses will kind of escape their ranches, the missions that the Spanish had set up, and very quickly we have a wild horse population in the American Southwest. And by the late 1500s, the Plains Indians are going to have horses and become really masters of them. So this is, this is like 100 years, and Native Americans have been introduced to, adapted to, and mastered this new animal. In the Northeast, there will be, and these horses will be used for trade throughout the Americas. Not just transportation, but also trading as a product. Northeast, we talked about beaver pelts, furs being traded for European goods, metal metalware, copper pots, iron, axes, guns, etc. Okay, now the big one. We will talk about the Iroquois for this entire unit. They're going to play a significant role in the American Revolution. This is the powerhouse of the Atlantic seaboard. And they became a powerhouse. So as you'll see, their population is much of the Atlantic seaboard, but mainly in the central and northern, the middle and northern region. So the Iroquois is really going to develop strength after the breakup of the large Mississippian societies. Okay, quick quiz. What was the name of the Mississippian society, the largest in America? Cahokia, the Cahokian Society. And so this is going to break up into smaller confederates. And confederates are, smaller groupings, political groupings of, in this case, tribes. And there's going to be intense competition. It's kind of a vacuum when you have this huge power like the Cahokians that all of a sudden disappears and disperses. You have people who are fighting for power. Who's going to be controlling the trade networks? Who's going to be controlling or have access to the hunting grounds and the waterways? So there's going to be an intense growth in violence. And the Iroquois Confederation is going to rise out of this need for protection. They're going to take a number of different regional tribes and societies and band them together. Again, that's what we call a confederation. And this is out of a need for protection, to protect themselves against foreign groups. They're going to develop the same agricultural practices from those Mississippian societies and ultimately grow into a very large and powerful force in the Northeast. Now, they are, along with their power, they're going to be kind of the predominant trading group with the British. And from that trade, they are going to grow even more powerful. They're going to be battling the French, competing for fur and trapping lands, and really have these full-scale military assaults with the French. And again, at the beginning, this was a very close match. By no means did the European colonizers have an edge over the Native Americans. These were bloody battles with intense or incredible deaths on both sides. With the French, these are going to be called the Beaver Wars, and it's going to be a series of wars that take place in the Northeast. Many prisoners taken, and ultimately this is bringing them in a closer alliance with the English. Again, they're going to be trading with the British, helping to resupply their arms and their tools. And in return, we'll be trading valuable products with the, exchanging valuable products and knowledge with the British. And they'll ultimately be playing a key role in helping the King Philip's War, which we will again talk about, not this week, but the next week. We'll come back to the King Philip's War. Alright, lastly, Africans. This is the final piece of our Atlantic world. We've talked about societies in the Americas, in Europe, and now in Africa. Just like in the Americas, this is a very diverse ethnic population. And it's when we get to the Americas, it's going to be this merging of different cultures, customs, and languages. So as you can see from the map here, when we have the African forced migration into the Americas, we have many different regions of Africa. And so all those people are, Africa is not a country, it's a continent, and with it is an incredible number of different languages and customs that are being mixed into the Americas. Although they are all diverse and have these different backgrounds, what will unite Africans in the New World will be this common experience, and that is the Middle Passage. And this was a incredibly trying, gruesome, inhumane experience where people were stacked on end, head to toe, as you see in the pictures here, like cattle, like livestock, and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, which would take weeks, if not months, depending on the season, and very little subsistence, really just enough to keep them alive. There were many deaths that occurred on these transports, and it was just a horrifying experience. Families were broken up, and you were kind of lucky to make it alive across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, we will talk about the Middle Passage and this experience, throughout this unit and into the next unit. Up to, we'll be talking about slavery itself up to the Civil War. However, it's going to be really important to note that there is no significant large number of slave labor in the population until the late 1600s. We'll talk about the beginnings of the British settlement in 1607 with Jamestown, and then the 1620s with Plymouth and the Puritans. So it's really taking 80 to 100 years for slave labor to take off. And there's a couple of reasons for that. For the most part, it's too expensive for most colonists. There's far too many costs already up front in order to make this trip manageable. And ultimately, they're relying on their own labor. However, those that do come will bring valuable information. Rice cultivation is going to be one that is how to grow rice is going to be brought by Africans and taught to British settlers. And in many ways, the development of rice in the New World will be with the knowledge of and the labor of African slaves. So, lastly, we're going to talk about slavery for this entire semester, and I think it's important to begin with just a little bit of background about this worldwide institution. This is an American history class, and I think it would be easy to presume by the end of this semester that America was the only country that practiced slavery. And the truth is that it's simply not the case. It is unique in many ways, and we'll talk about how, but America is not the sole producer and trader of slave labor. Nearly every civilization has endured slavery at some point. However, the big difference in the past is that it has not been based on race. And we will talk about race this semester and how this idea of a racial identity developed. So that is something that was very specific that was developed in the Americas. In the past, slave labor was from prisoners of war. They were labor shortages, economic demand, or difficult tasks. And ultimately, they would go out and find and capture people to perform these tasks, oftentimes after a war. Now, the first African slave was transported to the Caribbean in 1518, and the first African slaves in the Chesapeake were 1619. So this is about 10 years after the first development, the settlement of Jamestown. So after 10 years in Jamestown, the very first African slave was brought. So why Africa? I think this is an important question. There were traditionally slaves in all different societies and civilizations, and they weren't African. They weren't always African. So there's a couple of different reasons, and we're going to outline them here. One, that there's a growing demand for sugar and a plantation model of labor. This is going to require a workforce beyond what can be acquired through indentured servitude, which we'll talk about in the days to come. And ultimately, the slaves that existed prior to this time period were the Balkans. And this is actually what will become to be known as the Slavic, which is actually short for slave, Slavic slave. African slaves will ultimately replace Native American slaves. And again, the primary reason for that was Native Americans were dying in just obscene numbers, and so their population was reducing as opposed to expanding. And finally, there's going to be an existing slave trade in Africa, a slave trade that was started by and continued by African societies. Most case scenarios, as was in the rest of the world, these slaves were captured as prisoners of war and then traded as such. Now, so how did Europeans get into the mix here? And ultimately developed kind of a race-based kind of association with slavery. The first origins of this racist kind of connotations towards Africans and slavery is going to be from European traders' accounts. The first off is they're going to be different. They're going to be seen as savages, again going back to that idea of morality, of being naked and not clothed. Their eating and custom is going to be different than that of Europeans, and ultimately seen as savage. Their religion, not Christian, and their cultural and custom practices are going to be more sexual than the Christian tradition and customs, and so that is also going to be seen as a large difference, and ultimately result in moral judgment. There's been consistent and long-standing trade with Central Africa. Muslim traders crossing the Sahara Desert. You may remember back in 7th grade studying Mansa Musa, the wealthiest man in the world, largest gold deposits in Central Africa, and there was great trade between his society and Muslims and Egyptian traders throughout the ancient world. And those accounts of Africa describe them as lacking civilization, but specifically lacking the science. Next, the African environment. There's going to be these conclusions made about what sort of environment and what creates a type of person, and what type of person will be more suited for a particular type of labor. And really, the logic goes in this sense that it's hot in Africa, so those people are better suited for hot, strenuous labor. Very simple, although illogical conclusion. We're also, we'll talk about this more, and this is more in line with kind of the spiritual and magical explanations of science. They're called humors, and temperature was also associated with your morality, where cool temperatures were more seen as moral and pure. Very hot temperatures are going to be seen as sinful. So people who came from hot temperatures were going to be naturally seen as sinners. And finally, we have the development of slave codes, and this is perhaps one of the biggest and most important contributors to the existence of racist origins for slavery in America. Slave codes developed in 1662. They were brought to America from the Caribbean, and ultimately it's a way to keep slaves subservient. It's meant to protect the white population, the white slave owners, against a growing slave population. So at a certain point, the slave population is well outnumbering the white population in the Caribbean and then growing into the American South. And with that comes a fear of revolt, a fear of their forced labor turning against them. And so what is created then is a series of rules and that are applied to slaves based on their identity. So if you are black, then you are a slave, and you have these restrictions. You have curfews. You have not allowed to read, because if you can read, you can write, and if you can write, you can organize a rebellion. All of these rules meant to keep a group in place, subservient and not a threat, and it was based on the color of their skin. And so it's with these slave codes that we begin to then associate African and African Americans, dark-skinned individuals, with slavery and with subhuman characteristics or description, how they would see these individuals. Okay, that is going to call it for today. Thank you for listening. I'll be checking these notes on their due dates, which will be the block day, and we will see you then.